Hi, my name is Katrina Branscombe, and this is my final project presentation for the Criminal Justice Capstone. The first chapter focuses on President Johnson's address to Congress and President Barack Obama's interim report of the 21st century policing. President Johnson's address to Congress was done in 1965 when crime was at an all-time high and it had doubled within a 5-year period of time. Instead of waiting for the crime to fix itself, Johnson called for immediate action because the crime that was growing was more complex. More needed to be done to assist law enforcement in combating crime, like additional training and research, as well as informing the public of what was happening. Johnson also felt that there needed to be a partnership with federal agencies as well. Today, there's a huge distrust between law enforcement agencies and the community. President Obama notated this, and a task force was created to build a trust between the officers and the community task force that included 7 sessions that will be discussed further in Chapter 12 and 13 of this presentation. President Johnson and Obama both wanted to create a long-term approach in policing and combating crime. Johnson wanted to ensure that every asset would be used to assist law enforcement in the efforts to get a handle on the increasing crime. However, President Obama wanted to shift his focus on the community and mend the relationships between the police and the community. Chapter 2 starts our focus on the challenge of crime in a free society. Challenges of Crime in a Free Society, which was a report written by the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and Administration of Justice, was created in 1967. This commission was established by President Johnson due to the urgency of the nation's crime problem. Crime was a serious domestic problem in the 60s, and citizens were afraid of being attacked. However, only serious crimes were likely to be reported due to the public feeling as there may be repercussions for their reports. Most commonly, violent crimes were reported. The public was concerned with poverty neighborhoods as well. Most who lived there stayed inside locked doors rather than risking walking the streets at night. The Commission felt that their concerns and fears of public safety were justified. Reducing youth crime was also a big concern for the Commission. They felt as if the youth is our future, and if we got a handle on youth crime and the housing situations that they live in, then it could help further crime reduction. The community looks to police for protection, so with that being said, there needed to be a bond between the police and the community. This would be where the establishment of community policing would begin. Even in 1967, the Commission felt as if the recruitment of future officers was one of the biggest issues that the agencies had to deal with in order to protect the future. The courts regulate the flow of the criminal process. The criminal process begins with the statutes and practices that are built upon the model of the English common law. Criminal penalties can only be imposed after a person is arrested. Corrections is the hidden entity of the criminal justice system. Throughout the years, billions of dollars are spent on housing offenders. The housing in these facilities are often poor and would reinforce the pattern of offending. Most offenders end up falling into a pattern of recidivism. Organized crimes are activities that thrive on money and power by creating and employing illegitimate methods to gain ultimate control. There are various types of crimes that fall into the category of organized crimes. These crimes include gambling, loan sharking, narcotics, trafficking, prostitution, and bootlegging. Members of these organized crimes are usually found within larger cities, but there have been known to be some in the local sectors. When it comes to trying to control the nation's organized crime problem, finding and prosecuting these cartels can prove to be difficult. This is due to the lack of resources and knowledge. In 1967, there were 2 different classifications of drugs, narcotics and dangerous drugs. Narcotics in 1967 included drugs such as opiates like heroin, cocaine, and marijuana. Dangerous drugs would be classified as amphetamines and hallucinogens such as LSD. The Commission would recommend that there be further research on these drugs so that there could be further framework on the criminal laws of narcotic use, as well as further programs that would educate law enforcement on the effects of the drugs. These drugs were often smuggled across the borders internationally, making it crucial to protect our ports and borders, with the drugs being a lot harder to find once they were already broken up into smaller forms. Drunken offenses would burden police and clog up the criminal courts. Depending on the jurisdiction of the drunken offense, it would not be classified as a crime unless there was a breach to the public order. The maximum punishment for a drunken offense could range anywhere from 5 days to 6 months and 2 years for any habitual offenders. Offenders would range from college students to homeless veterans. The Commission felt that in regards to firearms, there needed to be a system in place to help balance out the citizens' need for a firearm for their protection and regulating the sale of firearms to keep them out of potential criminal hands. These systems needed to be strengthened. Gun laws vary in each state and town and have their own regulation, but the Commission felt that there needed to be a buckle down on regulations, especially when it came to the sale and ownership of assault rifles. Technologies would start to prove useful to criminal justice professionals. New devices would start to help improve agencies in their attempts to deter crime and apprehend criminals. The Task Force on Science and Technology would bring a new viewpoint to analytical data. The Commission would encourage this data to be used to help police operations. The new gathering of analytical data would help police and the court system with keeping offenders on record and give police an idea of how much crime there really is. The Commission, throughout its research in 1967, found that the greatest need that the criminal justice system needed was research. The biggest suggestion that the Commission would continue to make would be that criminal justice agencies develop a research department filled with specialists and scholars. Each state is different in the way that agencies run, so there is no formal way that the states can implement protocols for implementing crime prevention and control. All levels would need to collaborate in order for everything to run cohesively and not be overlooked. Chapter 5 will focus on the ominous Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968. This act would encourage both state and local law enforcement agencies to adopt and prepare comprehensive law enforcement plans based upon the problems that have been evaluated within law enforcement. In 1967, at the time the President's Commission report was established, grants were already being utilized for research, planning, and demonstration projects. The problem of how easily it is for someone to obtain a firearm has always been a problem within our country. There are regulations when it comes to a person's age, criminal history, and mental state. This is to deter from firearms getting in the wrong hands. Trafficking of firearms is a major issue due to the fact that authorities don't know what weapons are being passed around within their own borders. Due to this, the ominous Crime Control Act would want to strengthen all gun control laws. Wiretapping had been used as a means to arrest and convict members of organized crime families for years and was found admissible in 1928 as evidence where all information that was gathered could be used. This would, however, violate a person's Fourth Amendment, and Congress set legislation into place that ensured all information that would be gained would be obtained lawfully. This would ban all use of wiretapping except when it came to national strategies. When the FBI was established in 1908, it was ran with around 31 investigators. However, now it is ran with 35,000 employees. This includes 56 field officers throughout the nation. The FBI hires special agents and support professionals that include intelligence analysis, scientists, IT specialists, and language specialists. With the combination of violent behaviors rising in the South and the civil rights movement, as well as the increase in organized crime families uprising, the FBI found that they would need to expand their intelligence efforts if they were going to keep up. The Miranda warning laws were created after police refused to allow a man to remain silent, as well as his right to counsel. This was found to be a violation of the subject's right, with his conviction eventually being overturned after being found he was coerced into a confession. Now police are supposed to inform a person after they are arrested that they have the right to remain silent, they have the right to speak to an attorney, and that anything they say can and will be held against them in the court of law. The Organized Crime Control Act of the 1970s was to seek the eradication of organized crime. This would help isolate and exclude crimes that are associated with organized crime and help stop the spread of them. Some people unintentionally participate in organized crime, and it's not just families and ethnic gangs. This is through passing of federal U.S. mail to receive funds, and it can be unintentionally used as a way to gain money for business fraud. Public awareness became a debate on whether we should allow the public to know about organized crime findings, because this would either make the organized crime groups go further underground. However, Congress felt that there may be a benefit to the public knowledge so that the community has a chance to eradicate crime. In today's society, there are many groups that are still being formed internationally. When you think of organized crime, you think of the Italian Mafia. Now it's not just the Italian Mafia. There are Russian mobs, Latin cartels, Japanese gangs, and inner-city gangs such as the Blood, Crips, and Latin Kings. These are starting to make their way to the forefront of organized crime. Chapter 8 focused on the federal grant amendments of the Crime Control Act of 1973. Chapter 7. In order for law enforcement to have the ability to do their job safely and effectively, they must have the proper resources available to them. This is why federal grants is such a pertinent issue. Grants that are awarded would be used for training, equipment, research, education, recruitment, wages increases, and construction of facilities such as rehab centers and jail facilities. Chapter 8 focuses on juvenile justice. The first point is the deinstitutionalization of status offenders. A status offender can be defined as a juvenile that is charged with a crime that would otherwise not be seen as a crime if it were committed by an adult. The institutionalization of status offenders is when a juvenile commits one of these acts, they are not to be held in a secure detention facility. Instead, they are to be given a community service option or home treatment option, alternative education, or job development support. Sight and sound separation refers to the lack of sharing a common space or eye contact with adults, and the prevention of hearing adults as well to keep the youth out of earshot. This is to prevent youth from getting and obtaining any psychological or physical abuse that might happen with adult offenders. A juvenile is to only be held in an adult facility for up to 6 hours, whether it be before or after a court hearing or when they are first detained. Housing a juvenile in an adult facility can cause a lot of social and psychological repercussions. Juveniles that are isolated from their peers can cause depression, anger causing a social decline. More effects that can come from the isolation is a juvenile's education. By isolating a juvenile, their education can be taken away. They are taken away from their classes, which can cause a youth to drop out of school and lead to the recidivism that we are ultimately trying to prevent. Disproportionate minority contact, or DMC, is the progress that is made each year in the prevention and improvement efforts to reduce the rate of minority groups and their interaction with the juvenile justice system. The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention provides resources, coordination, leadership that is aimed towards the prevention of juvenile delinquency and victimization. The OJJDP helps by funding research efforts, training programs, and funds programs throughout the nation. Programs can not only help by decreasing juvenile delinquency, but can also work to help these offenders transition into adulthood. The Armed Career Criminal Act of 1984 was set forth to amend the ominous Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968. This amendment would establish a mandatory 15-year sentence and a $25,000 fine for all armed career criminals. A career criminal is anyone who has 3 or more prior convictions for a violent or serious offense, and then they commit another crime while being in possession of a firearm. Many who oppose this amendment often say that it is a violation of somebody's Fourth Amendment, or it can enable double jeopardy. Their Eighth Amendment. Due to holding past crimes against a person who already served their punishment for that crime, it is often considered double jeopardy. The Sentence Reform Act of 1984 would set a new sentencing structure into place for any person found guilty of a federal statute. A guilty person would be sentenced to either imprisonment or probation with fines and added sanctions such as probation and restitution. Courts must also now give reasoning for the sentences they are imposing. The Sentencing Reform Act would also ask judges to find a way around imprisonment in hopes to reduce prison populations. The original purpose of the Secret Service was to investigate the counterfeiting of U.S. currency. This includes the cyber and banking systems. In most cases, when a personal credit card is stolen, the case is handled by either local or state law enforcement. However, the Secret Service does provide backup, aid, and legal support for these agencies in their cases. For Secret Service and Federal Trade Commission to take over a credit card fraud case, the amount of funds that needs to be stolen has to be greater than $2,000. When it comes to marijuana cultivation, there we go. When it comes to marijuana cultivation, marijuana has now been reclassified from a narcotic to an hallucinogen, making it a misdemeanor offense. People who are arrested for marijuana are often either given a fine or minimal imprisonment of a few days, with the maximum being 1 year in jail. However, when people start becoming habitual offenders, they are given more time onto their sentence. Our Fifth Amendment prevents cruel and unusual punishment. However, there are 60 qualifying offenses for the death penalty. Oh, I completely skipped hostage taking. This includes homicide offenses, espionage, and treason. The most common way that offenders who are sentenced to the death penalty are executed is through lethal injection. A civil forfeiture occurs when the government seizes property under suspicion of its involvement in legal activity. The government uses civil forfeitures as a tool against drug trades and organized crime, but it can be seen among protesters as unconstitutional use of government power and a violation of our Fourth Amendment. According to the Crime Control Act of 1990, there are approximately 2 million people who report child abuse cases made each year. Drug abuse is a substantial reasoning for these reports. Multidisciplinary teams include professionals that work to ensure that child abuse and neglect get the proper response that they deserve. The coordination of these efforts, due to the introduction of the Victims of Child Abuse Act of 1990, would reduce the possibility of causing the child further trauma by having to retell their story multiple times. The Crime Control Act of 1990 would extend penalties for sexual abuse against child offenses. These offenses not only include the physical act of sexually abusing a minor, but also include the distribution and possession of child pornography. The penalty for first-time offenders would be fined or imprisoned for no more than 10 years. A person with a prior conviction would find themselves fined and imprisoned for no less than 5 years and not more than 15 years. The physical act of sexually abusing a child, the offender would find themselves serving penalties that will affect them for the rest of their lives, and they would be labeled as a sex offender and have to abide by the registration laws of the state that they reside in. When someone is considered a victim of a crime, they must be afforded the rights as provided by the Victim Rights and Restitution Act of 1990. The following rights are: a victim's dignity and privacy must be treated with respect. They have the right to seek protection from their offender. They have the right to be notified of all the offender's court proceedings, as well as the right to be present for all the proceedings unless it affects the testimony of the victim. They have the right to confer with an attorney for the government and the right to restitution. They also have the right to be informed of the conviction, sentencing, imprisonment, and release of their offender. The Drug Enforcement Administration, the Department of Health and Human Resources, as well as other government agencies would be responsible for conducting a review of raw narcotic imports that come in from Turkey and India. This would regulate the illicit and licit opiate products that would come into the United States. The Crime Control Act would also increase the offense level for any offense that involved the smokable version of crystal meth. Courts would also ensure that offenders that were convicted for the substance would be afforded drug treatment programs. The Crime Control Act of 1994 banned the use and possession of all semi-automatic assault weapons. A semi-automatic firearm is considered to be a military-like weapon that carries a large detachable magazine that fires multiple rounds quickly and more efficiently. When this act was put into place, it was responsible for a 6.7% decrease of murders by firearms. The Federal Death Penalty Act of 1994 established procedures that needed to be followed when the courts decided to impose the death penalty. This act would authorize the death penalty for any offender who is convicted of murder while engaging in the acts of a criminal enterprise. For the death penalty to be implemented, the court must find that the offender was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt and that an aggravating factor existed. Even though most states have their own regulations when it comes to the death penalty, the Federal Death Penalty Act expansion would allow the federal courts to implement the death penalty in any state or territory that they see fit if it was one of the 60 eligible crimes, even states that did not legalize the death penalty. Education in the prison system is a topic that is highly debated. This is because some believe that the system is too relaxed and that our tax money should not be going to the funding of inmate programs. In 1965, President Johnson signed the Higher Education Act. This act would allow prisoners to receive a Pell Grant to fund college courses while incarcerated. This would ultimately be a limit after the tough on crime attitude was passed. However, Congress eventually would allow offenders to be awarded some kind of post-secondary education with the hopes that it would help reduce recidivism rates. The Violence Against Women Act of 1994 would provide funding for a wide range of programs for women who were the victim of domestic violence, such as domestic violence programs to civil rights remedies for women. This act would ensure that women are afforded shelters, education, and public transportation safety. This act would also fund research and education on victims and provide training for court personnel and judges. The Community-Oriented Police Service Program was created with the mission of advancing community policing in all jurisdictions in the United States. This title would be divided into 3 separate grant programs. The first program would be used to hire and rehire police officers, as well as provide support systems for overtime pay and obtaining equipment. The second program would be used to hire former members of the armed services for a career in community policing. The third program would be utilized for non-hiring purposes, such as training of law enforcement on community policing techniques, crime prevention strategies, and the development of technologies that would help emphasize community policing. The President's Task Force was created to strengthen the trust and cooperation between the community and law enforcement officers that serve them. This task force was established by President Barack Obama and consists of 11 members that include academic, law enforcement officials, and civil rights activists. There are 6 topics or pillars that the task force are organized around. The first pillar focuses on building trust and legitimacy. This foundation is to ensure that there is trust between both the citizens and the police to ensure that they are treating each other fairly with the same common goal in mind, and that is to maintain public safety and a peaceful atmosphere. Trust and respect doesn't only need to be in the community and law enforcement, but also needs to be established within the law enforcement agency itself. There needs to be a mutual respect and understanding between an officer and their supervisors and peers. The policy and oversight pillar emphasized that community values must be reflected in policies that are abided by the police. In order for effective policies to be created, agencies needed to get together with neighborhoods, especially those that are highly affected by crime. These policies also needed to be transparent to these neighborhoods and properly articulated within the community to establish credibility and faith that the police officers are acting with their best interests in mind. Technology can be used as a great tool when it comes to interacting with the community. One of the biggest pushes with new technologies is the utilization of body cameras. Social media can either be seen as a great tool to connect with the community or can be a horrendous tool in spreading anti-police propaganda. The presence of social media can also be positive, as it can help with community relations and get the community involved with what's going on within their local police agency. The idea of community policing emphasizes the partnership and working relationship that law enforcement agencies build within their neighborhoods. The obligation of a law enforcement officer is to reduce crime and to do so by equally protecting the rights of the citizens. An officer's goal is to not completely eliminate crime, but to protect public safety while respecting the rights and dignity of the citizens. Community policing is all about helping the public realize that the police officer is an ally rather than an enemy. Training and education pertains to the constant training and education that a law enforcement officer needs to withhold their entire career. An officer's training begins during their recruitment through their basic law enforcement academy training and into in-service training. The need for constant training stems from our ever-changing communities and development. Line of duty deaths are extremely high, and even though the job of a police officer can be extremely dangerous with armed criminals and violence, the most violent or the most cause of death, it comes from mental and physical health. This is due to a lack of exercise, poor nutrition, and sleep deprivation. Most of the times, officers can't go get food. They're stuck getting fast food because they are constantly waiting for the next call. Another factor in officer wellness is that most officers can find themselves stressed or depressed. Depression can lead to suicide, so mental evaluation should be utilized more frequently within agencies as a prevention area. The future. So the beat cop was originally started in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They were used to help the communities, whether they were ill, they were hungry or unemployed, or helping the unemployed to seek jobs. In the 1970s and 80s, issues were not typically law enforcement issues started becoming the forefront of what officers were being utilized for. These included matters such as domestic violence, vandalism, loitering, fare evasion, littering, and panhandling. Today, law enforcement officers are now focused on a few major issues that were not an issue in the past. These are anti-terrorism issues, body cameras, civil rights, criminal prosecution of officers, recruitment, and social media. In the future, we have to fear the growth of terrorism. It is ever rising. The changing demographics and technological advancements are also risks as well. America is becoming even more diversified with more foreign-born Americans. So our country is becoming even more of a melting pot than we already are. And as technology starts to evolve, so do criminals. Law enforcement has to ensure that they are involving with the criminals in order to stay one step ahead. Thank you, and have a good day.